First of all, I just wanted to say that if you need closed captions, please, you can turn those on your options. And so they are being automatically generated. Apologies if they're off or if I mumble too much, but I'll try to speak as loudly and clearly as possible. Also, to let you know, we are recording this meeting and it will be available on our YouTube channel, once we kind of get it all processed and uploaded. And so that will be available so you can kind of refer back to when formulating comments. All right, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our second outreach meeting with the public on the development of the conservation plan, the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Plan. My name is Drew Kaiser, and I'm a senior environmental scientist with the Native Plant Program here at CDFW. And I'm also the technical lead for the working group that is developing the conservation plan. And so I just wanted to also point out that, there's a lot of different departments, CDFW, different regions. And so what my program does right here is basically just the conservation plan. So if there are questions or concerns with individual projects, I won't be able to kind of answer those. And so if we could just keep the focus of the meeting on the conservation plan and the contents of the presentation, and that would be much appreciated. All right. So during this meeting, we're going to go over a brief overview of how the conservation plan will be structured. However, the purpose of the meeting will be to present some of the management actions that are necessary to conserve the species, as well as a little bit on the implementation of those management actions, and to gather feedback from you all on those management actions and implementation piece. So if you were either at the last meeting, the first conservation plan meeting, you might recognize this slide. We also sent out a link to the recording of that. So if you'd like to see it, it's also available on our YouTube. You can just check it out, CDFW's YouTube. But this slide just shows the things that the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act requires to be in the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Plan. And those things are a description of management actions necessary to conserve the species, measurable criteria to assess the effectiveness of those actions, guidance to avoid and minimize impacts to Western Joshua Tree, protocols for the successful relocation of Western Joshua Tree, and to collaborate and coordinate with California Native American tribes to include co-management principles, incorporate traditional ecological knowledge, and to provide for the relocation of Western Joshua Tree to tribal lands upon request. And so the conservation plan will kind of be structured into these different sections. The introduction will cover the purpose, need, vision, and the objectives of the conservation plan. The planning influences will include a synthesis of the various planning documents, regulations, and other applicable laws from federal, state, and local jurisdictions. The chapter on tribal nation values will provide an overview of the California Native American tribes' traditional values, uses of, and collective experience and knowledge adapted to local environment systems, which is known as traditional ecological knowledge, as it relates to Western Joshua Tree. And then the summary of resources will include the various biological and environmental factors affecting the species. The management actions will include the things necessary to conserve the species, as well as effectiveness criteria, which we'll go over. The implementation section will cover CDFW's strategies and ideas for implementing those management actions. We'll also have a section on the agencies, organizations, tribes, public, that help to come together to develop the plan. And then we'll include also just the references and appendices, which will contain maybe some of the more scientific knowledge, your scientific information that was used to base a lot of the actions on, as well as some of the technical, protocols and things like that. And so for this meeting, we are going to present some of the ideas that are in development for management actions that are necessary to conserve the species and to gather feedback from you. All right. So this management actions section will be broken down into these categories. They include the guidance to avoid and minimize direct and indirect impacts, the land conservation and management strategies, the tribal nation co-management strategies, as well as the research and information that can help inform adaptive management and conserve the species, and how it will be incorporated when it is available. And then we're also going to be including effectiveness criteria kind of in this section at the end. And so for this first section, we broke it out into two major themes. The first is the guidance to avoid direct and indirect impacts. And then the second is to minimize direct and indirect impacts. All right. And so in here, we're providing guidance to avoid direct and indirect impacts of Western Joshua Tree, including both the above ground and the below ground parts, as well as the parts thereof, which include seed and their habitat. And so the preferred way to reduce impacts to Western Joshua Tree and its habitat is to avoid those impacts altogether. While impacts from climate change may be impossible to avoid, other impacts are avoidable, such as project-related degradation and destruction of habitat. But we understand that projects and activities, both small and large, are going to occur in and around Joshua trees. And so, what are appropriate distances to fully avoid impacts to the trees, roots, seeds, and pollinators? So for this, you have to kind of imagine a set of concentric circles with a Joshua tree, a fully mature Joshua tree in the middle. And so the outermost circle would represent where seeds have the potential to occur. And so this is called the seed bank. And so we know from scientific research that small rodents are the main seed dispersers of Joshua trees. And they usually don't carry Joshua trees long distances. And so they're not being spread by wind, they're not being spread by birds, they're not being spread by large mammals. And so these little seed caching rodents usually only carry seed a few hundred feet from a tree. And so to avoid impacts to seed bank ground serving activities would have to occur outside of these areas. And so the next circle in involves the roots of the tree. And so there's not a lot of research that tells us what the maximum distance a root can grow from a tree, fully mature tree. But there are some observations out there. And so far, we are kind of setting on a distance between 25 and 50 feet, depending on the size and life stage of the tree. So the next circle in involves the drip line of a Joshua tree, or the canopy, or how far its branches stick out. And so this area relates to the yucca moth pollinator, which is a symbiotic pollinator. It's the only thing that can pollinate Joshua trees. And so a little on the biology of yucca moths is that a fully adult yucca moth will take a pollen ball, and then it will take it from one flower and put it into another flower, another stigma. So when it does this, it also lays eggs inside the ovary of the flower. And then when the flower develops and the fruit develops, so do the larvae. the larvae burrow out of the fruit and then kind of drop to the ground there, right below where the fruits are. They burrow into the ground, and then they stay there, and then they develop. And then at a later date and time, they emerge from the ground as fully formed adults, and then fly off to pollinate more Joshua trees. And so this canopy or this drip line area is important for avoiding impacts to Joshua tree's sole pollinator. And things like ground disturbance or insecticide, things like that should be avoided in these areas especially. And then kind of this last circle, which is really close to the Joshua tree, kind of involves the root ball of the Joshua tree. So this is in very close proximity to the trunk. It has a dense concentration of small fibrous roots, which are the most important areas to avoid severe impacts, to avoid killing the tree itself. All right, and so when avoiding trees, we need to make sure that there are appropriate measures to prevent accidental encroachment or other kind of incidences. And so these areas need to be clearly flagged and fenced off. There should be biological monitors on site when activities are occurring around Joshua trees, and workers should be educated on what these buffers mean and how to identify them on site. And then one more thing about this is that, the best available science, we are using the best available science to kind of determine what these buffers are. And so, we should review the science and refine these buffers as appropriate. All right. So, we're also developing some guidance on avoiding direct and indirect impacts during wildfire suppression activities. Because we know fires are going to occur in Joshua tree habitat. It is one of their greatest threats. And then climate refugia, which are going to be important for long-term conservation of Joshua tree, are densely vegetated, making them very fire prone. And so some of the things that we're including in this section are avoiding killing trees when constructing things like hand lines or landing zones, and moving them if there's latitude to do so. Using narrow hand lines instead of dozer lines or black lines, like you can see on the bottom right here, which is where they kind of backfire off of a road to kind of increase, the defensible space when a fire is approaching. Tying into existing fire breaks and if they are available. And then, once all of these measures and the strategy is kind of developed, CDFW and land managers should work with local fire departments, CAL FIRE, and federal agencies to implement them. So other things that have the potential to directly and indirectly impact Joshua trees are the use of herbicides. And so for here, we're developing kind of a set of best practices that should be implemented to avoid things like incidental drift onto Joshua trees when using Joshua trees in Joshua tree habitat, and other kind of just best practices. All right, for outdoor recreation, there is potential for Joshua trees to, be run over by OHVs that can't necessarily see Joshua trees if they're like kind of off trail. There's potential for hikers and climbers and bikers to kind of indirectly impact or directly impact Joshua tree habitat and Joshua trees. And so we are just providing some guidance on there onto avoid impacts, which could include things like making sure that OHVs stick to trails in Joshua tree habitat, barriers are maintained, and that folks are sticking to trails when hiking and things like that. All right, so for the last thing in here, we have, some measures on grazing. And so for these, there is potential for cattle, livestock, other, herbivores to potentially eat or, trample Joshua trees. And so to avoid impacts to Joshua trees, things can be done, actions can be done to either like reduce, portions of grazing allotments with Western Joshua tree on there. If there's populations that are small, they can be like kind of fenced off from cattle. Or, we can, grazing leases can be retired in Western Joshua tree habitat. All right, and so when complete avoidance is not possible, efforts should be made to minimize impacts to Western Joshua tree and its habitat. Minimization may include efforts to reduce the number of trees or seeds that are impacted, and to reduce the area of the habitat that is impacted. They could reduce the severity of the impacts to individual trees and other organisms. And they can also reduce various indirect impacts to seeds, trees, things like that. So, and then for these, climate refugia and ecologically core and intact areas are going to be important for the preservation of the species. And so special consideration should be made, especially in these areas when working in these areas. Some measures may include things like preserving trees in place if sublethal impacts are expected, reducing impacts closer to the root ball when working within avoidance buffers, mowing vegetation as opposed to grading it to preserve seed bank, and preventing and remediating soil erosion. For tree relocation, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, we view this as a minimization measure because while there are successful accounts of tree relocation, there is no foolproof method that guarantees it. And we'll talk about this in a second, but if trees are expected to receive lethal impacts, they should be relocated. And folks should follow guidelines and protocols based on the best available science. Seed collection should occur if seed is available from impacted trees, and it should be stored for potential conservation purposes. Impacts should be minimized from invasive species, and so best management practices could include things like ensuring project materials do not contain invasive pests in them, inspecting clothing, boots, and equipment for soil and invasive pests before arriving in Western Joshua tree habitat, disposing of invasive plant materials appropriately outside of Western Joshua tree habitat, and then minimizing soil disturbance to the greatest extent practicable. And so for wildfire suppression, wildfire being one of the greatest threats to Joshua tree, along with climate change and development. First priority is to fight fires aggressively in and around Western Joshua tree habitat to minimize the loss of trees and to minimize the loss of the nurse plants and other associated species that help ecosystems thrive. The suppression activities, to minimize suppression activities, we could also do things like avoiding fire retardant, which contains high nitrogen and phosphorus to the greatest extent practicable. If fires are small, they're slow moving, and water drops and things like that could be used instead. So when fires are fought, Often fire breaks are created, which can expose soil and create corridors for invasive species to proliferate. And so we're recommending that these areas be, either like a fine layer of mulch be spread over them in order to reduce erosion and promote microbial activity, which will uptake some available nutrients and prevent them from being utilized by invasive species. And then also other minimization measures for fire suppression, just limiting invasive species like we just talked about. For wildfire prevention, we should be actively trying to prevent large-scale fires. Fire breaks, if they already exist, should be maintained. This may include things like dirt roads through climate refugia, which can often act as a little bit of a fire break and create unburned islands kind of near them. And fuel treatments can be done in these, high priority conservation areas to minimize impacts when fires do occur. This could include things like doing herbicide treatments on invasive annual grasses, or even targeted flash grazing, which we've heard that some organizations are doing with their Western Joshua tree habitat. And then on the topic of grazing, too much grazing pressure, as we mentioned, is bad for Western Joshua tree and these fragile desert environments. And so when restricting grazing is not possible in these areas, there are management actions that can be implemented to reduce grazing intensity. These could include things like lowering stocking rates or implementing deferred grazing systems as opposed to perennial year-round systems. And then we also view public education and responsible recreation as a way to minimize impacts. And so, these could include things like building partnerships with responsible user groups, like, for instance, Overland Bound or the Tread Lightly organizations to kind of promote responsible recreation. Implementing education programs and national parks and forests and public lands to try to prevent things like, tying hammocks and slack lines or to Joshua trees, or disrupting or disturbing habitat, bringing in invasive species, kind of things like that. And so a lot of these measures are still in development. We are kind of going into each one of these kind of a little bit more detail than what I've just done right now. All right. So as I mentioned, we view relocation as a minimization measure rather than an alternate form of mitigation. The Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act required CDFW to create guidelines and protocols for the successful relocation of Western Joshua tree. The act required that it be based on the best available scientific information and developed in consultation with desert native plant specialists. And so what we did, we compiled everything we could from the scientific literature, from handbooks, and from getting accounts from folks that have extensive experience relocating Joshua trees. I am happy to say that we just released these yesterday. And so these are available now on our website. If you're able to, you can scan this QR code to kind of pull up the page that it's on, but it's under our Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act ITP permitting page. And so these are available that you can look at, but they just cover, like, these are just the sections in there. The introduction, just, kind of explains the purpose and need for the document. The document includes the requirements from the Western Joshua Tree Act that the relocation guidelines have in them. Some of the best available science and information that we could find is also in there. The guidelines cover the when and the where trees should be relocated. And then the protocols were based on kind of the synthesis of everything we could find. We consulted with numerous designated plant specialists on this to kind of get their feedback and experiences. And then we're also included in here are the maintenance and monitoring needs of the species. And then if this is done in relation to one of the incidental take permits, the reporting requirements for these relocated trees. All right, so that was the guidance to avoid direct and indirect, avoid and minimize direct and indirect impacts. The next section in the management actions chapter is the land conservation and management strategies. And so for here, we kind of have it broken down in 3 sections, which we'll go over here in a second. So this first section, with finite resources available for conservation efforts, we first need to prioritize lands to considered that are considered most important for the persistence of Western Joshua tree in the future. Conservation efforts need to focus on protecting populations that meet criteria for climate change resiliency and show characteristics of long-term viability. And so researchers are working on models to help us determine where these populations might be, which are known as climate refugia. And so this first objective in here will be to identify these areas, which, this criteria on the screen here kind of outlays some of the preliminary things. We're still kind of working with a lot of researchers to kind of, weigh things differently, like what needs to be preserved more than others. But just in general, these are the kind of like characteristics that we are looking at for identifying high priority conservation areas. So once we have identified these high priority conservation lands, we need to protect them. And so designation of federal, state, and local conservation areas, such as national monuments, state parks, ecological reserves, or public open spaces, could be one approach. Talking to the State School Lands Commission, there are conservation leases that we can place on state lands. A cooperative conservation agreement can be entered into amongst federal, state, and local agencies, which we'll talk about a little bit in a second. Land can be acquired by governments, tribes, and other organizations from willing sellers through fee title acquisitions. And then landowners can establish conservation easements on their own private property to preserve their Joshua trees in perpetuity without needing to sell. And then finally, memorandum of understanding can be entered into for non-federal tribal lands. All right, and so persistent and ongoing threats from climate change, wildfire, invasive species, and other human activities do not necessarily go away when land is permanently protected from development. And so land will need to be managed for the persistence of Western Joshua tree populations and its habitats. Just kind of high level things, which we're still kind of, fleshing out some of the details here. But we need to identify the priorities for managing. We need to ensure that there is funding to, implement these land management priorities, and then prioritize state, federal, and local lands for the benefit of Western Joshua tree. So restoration of damaged and degraded lands and enhancement of lands can occur to help support Western Joshua trees. And these are just two kind of techniques to implement in the aid in the implementation of conservation of the species. Some things that we are including kind of in here are incorporating traditional ecological knowledge to restore and enhance these lands. Allowing for tribal cultural uses and practices on these lands, remediating degraded lands, invasive species control, and then other native species restoration. We are working on a plan to, seed bank and conserve genetic information from populations and to have it available for restoration enhancement purposes. Working on wildlife and wildfire kind of treatments. Herbivores have the potential to strip bark or take down fully mature Joshua trees in times of drought. So some potential ways to remediate that, but and then also having a role in here for how nurseries can kind of help and the public in the restoration and stewardship of these lands. All right. So in order to help us determine where these management actions need to occur, we are kind of developing some criteria for delineating management units. And so you can see this criteria on here. It kind of goes in order of maybe like most important to kind of like not least important, but just like kind of how the structure might go. And so for this first one, kind of developing like 3 different categories here, areas that have been identified as predicted climate refugia, will be important for the long-term conservation of the species, but also marginal kind of climate refugia or marginal habitat in the future will be important for protecting and buffering stresses from development, invasive species, wildfire on these climate refugia areas. And then kind of a third category in here, just the unoccupied future suitable habitat. So these are areas where Joshua trees don't occur, but they might occur in the future. And so we don't necessarily want to box ourselves in by just conserving climate refugia. We want to have areas for trees and pollinators to migrate into the future as suitable habitat kind of opens up. And then just a note here, this is like kind of like a model from a paper that was done in 2011. It does not necessarily, I mean, like it's a great paper, but it doesn't necessarily represent the one that we are using right now to kind of help us determine where these climate refugia are. All right. And so the kind of this next criteria comes from a Mojave Desert eco-regional assessment that was originally done in 2010 by the Nature Conservancy, but then was updated in 2018. And so this assessment evaluated the entire Mojave Desert and kind of assigned it into 4 different categories for conservation value. And these are ecologically core areas, and these are the lands with highest conservation value. They are largely undisturbed, unfragmented, and can support conservation targets, such as ecological systems, biodiversity, seeps and springs, things like that. This next category down are ecologically intact lands, and so these are largely undisturbed and unfragmented, and they are important to buffer the ecologically core areas and allow them to remain undisturbed. And so, but there might be some previous impacts that maybe occurred on these lands. And the next category down is moderately degraded lands. And so these are areas that have been fragmented by roads, off-road trails, and are in close proximity to urban, agricultural, and other developments. They can often maintain ecological functionality, like maintaining groundwater infiltration, and serving as sources of sand. But they have been kind of degraded by these fragmented kind of things, activities. And then lastly, the last category are the highly modified areas. And so these are urban, suburban, agricultural lands that have been heavily altered. They can support conservation targets, but their ecological context is highly compromised. Our third criteria for our management units include the various federal, state, local, and tribal jurisdictional boundaries, and land ownership, kind of the different types of management that are occurring out there. And so we just provisionally kind of divided up all the different kind of management categories into these. And they include, you know, kind of things like the federally designated wilderness, which occurs on Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service, Forest Service lands. These are largely managed in the same way, even though they are managed by different agencies. Kind of this next category includes the areas with that are focused on preservation with maybe some light recreation or other uses. These could include things like national parks, California state land, California state parks, and other protected lands that are managed for conservation. For example, land trust lands or lands with conservation easements placed on them. Third category in here, defense lands, because you know, we know that, you know, there might be some impacts in like in and around near installations, but there are vast areas within these installations that are managed essentially like wilderness. They don't have a lot of visitation. They don't have a lot of other kind of impacts that might occur on other federal lands. Tribal lands, we're including a separate category in here because they are sovereign nations, but we are still in consultation with a lot of the tribes. And so, you know, we're gonna, you know, talk with them and see how they would like to kind of, you know, enter into the conservation strategy, which we'll talk about here in a second. We have areas of mixed use. So these are areas like Forest Service lands or Bureau of Land Management lands that are not kind of included in the categories above. And so these areas have kind of multiple use mandates, but they are somewhat protected, and there are areas, you know, some levels of protection that are placed on them. And then last category in here are areas with little to no protection. And so these include private lands, infrastructure lands, kind of school lands, having that in here. So this last category right here is also just is kind of a placeholder for now. And so, you know, we wanted to include it as another potential criteria that can affect which management actions occur where. And so, you know, through research, if things like climate adaptive traits are discovered within certain populations, that can help us inform, you know, conservation priorities, you know, when that research is available. But right now, we know it's kind of, it's in the works, but it's not quite there yet. And so we're just putting a placeholder in here. And so if you imagine those, you know, 3-4 different criteria and all those different kind of categories in there, and you kind of overlay them on top of each other, it kind of comes up with the mosaic of, you know, areas that are essentially managed in the same way. And then it also kind of informs which priorities and which management actions should occur where on the land. So that's kind of the breakdown of the management units. More to come on that. And so engagement and co-management of natural resources jointly between the state of California and California Native American tribes is an important state policy and a key management action for Western Joshua tree conservation. So we contacted roughly 70 federally and non-federally recognized California Native American tribes. We are currently actively working with about 15 or so who have indicated that they wish to participate in the development of the conservation plan and its implementation. However, these relationships take time. And so, we don't have anything to share specifically about this yet because we are still having conversations. But we just wanted to inform everyone that there will be co-management. We like to establish what these like co-management principles might be, and then which will eventually lead to kind of co-management activities and agreements that will occur, and kind of define, maybe some potential elements of co-management. All right. So this last category in here for the management actions is the research and information that can help inform the species, conservation of the species. And so, first of all, is like kind of like a housekeeping thing, but we need to develop standards on how data will be collected and reported on. The plan will also include kind of data gaps in the information that is available that could help inform management actions or just kind of conservation of the species. It'll also kind of explain how each of these might fit into the conservation plan once this information is available. And then lastly, the plan will evaluate the effectiveness of education and outreach. And then also particularly with the outreach and education, that will be important to the plan includes the plans focus on, outreach and education are important components of the plan, which ties into the plan's focus around protecting, managing, and conserving Western Joshua tree and its habitat. It's important that environmental justice is integrated within the plan in multiple ways, since many people living among Western Joshua tree, including disadvantaged communities, which is shown in red here, overlap with Western Joshua tree habitat. And so since this plan provides a platform that can outline the state's education and outreach priorities, the plan may provide a reference point for community organizations centered around environmental justice when applying for funding opportunities. And given that, this is where feedback by those connected to people and nature come in. And so priorities are heard and integrated in the plan. And so your priorities are heard and integrated into the plan. As mentioned, there will be some of the effectiveness criteria, which is kind of going to be presented preliminarily in kind of like two different sets. And so the first set of criteria relates to the overall conservation of the species within California. And then the second set of criteria relates to the effectiveness of the conservation plan and the conservation fund in making progress towards the vision of this conservation plan. So for conservation of the species in California, we are developing effectiveness criteria that includes reducing greenhouse gas emissions, as climate change is the greatest threat to Western Joshua tree populations. Western Joshua tree as a whole has the greatest chance of making populations go extinct, and so ensuring that emissions are reduced to a level that the species is not at risk of extinction is a conservation is an effectiveness criteria. And then another one would be that most of the predicted climate refugia is permanently protected with durable protections and some sort of in some activity in some way. Large and genetically representative populations are preserved, permanently protected to manage and manage to maximize ecological function for the species. Cooperative multi-agency strategies are in place to reduce fire risk and aggressively fight fires that threaten Western Joshua Tree, and ensure that restoration plans are fully funded to implement responses to wildfires that kill a demographically significant number of Western Joshua trees. And then lastly, that a program to monitor Western Joshua trees and assess them is developed based on the best available science and can inform whether the tree will be sustainable in California in the future. And so for the effectiveness criteria for the conservation plan and the fund, we are, some of the preliminary effectiveness criteria that we're developing are that priority lands are identified by the end of 2025, but ideally sooner. And that there will be a big push to protect a significant portion of those high priority lands that are currently unprotected by 2030, and that unprotected priority lands will be continued to be protected beyond 2030, but maybe less of a push. That those protected lands have funding for long-term management for maximizing the ecological function of the species, and a cooperative agreement is established between federal, state, local jurisdictions that protects and safeguards priority conservation areas by 2033. And then also MOUs between land management authorities and tribes that wish to participate in co-managing these ancestral lands with Western Joshua Tree are entered into no later than 2033, but hopefully much sooner. All right. So that was all the management actions and effectiveness criteria. We're going to just briefly talk about implementation because it's still kind of in development right now. We're having a lot of great conversations with federal, state, local agencies, the tribes, and you all. But so essentially this chapter will describe key mechanisms for the conservation plan's implementation. It'll describe the roles for the implementing parties and the ongoing implementation of monitoring and adaptive management essential for the plan. And so, yeah, as mentioned, we're still in discussion with many of these agencies. We're talking to cities, counties, special districts for local agencies, talking to California State Parks, School Lands Commission, CNRA, amongst many other agencies for the state. Speaking with, all the federal jurisdictions, a lot of the federal jurisdictions, and hope to form many partnerships with them for hopefully a conservation agreement. For tribal nations, we welcome any tribe that wishes to participate. Right now, we are really excited that we've made a lot of progress so far in this very short time that we've been given, but we know that these conversations will continue throughout development and implementation of conservation plan. And then collaborating with the public, which can include researchers, private and non-governmental organizations, and you all. All right. The implementation section will also, just kind of outline the various permitting mechanisms that are available and kind of how those work. There'll be a section on how the conservation fund will be spent, monitored, and fiscally responsible, and how the fee adjustments, or just that the fee adjustments, will occur on regular schedules. It'll cover land acquisition protocols, land acquisition protocols that are established, and kind of how land will be conserved in perpetuity. And then there'll be a section on monitoring or reporting to increase transparency in the actions of CDFW and in the conservation plan in general. There will also be a brief explanation, that the species will just be reevaluated for the Fish and Game Commission to reconsider listing in 2033. This is required in the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act. And then lastly, in this implementation section, it'll just explain how the plan is a living document, and it will be amended at regular intervals to ensure the conservation of the species.